Continuing on with Chapter 22, we're looking at Reconstruction, how the United States knit itself back together after the Civil War. Now, the president tried his form of Reconstruction, and he butted heads time and time again with Congress. Remember, Congress is primarily composed of Republicans. The president, Andrew Johnson, at this time is a Democrat. So from a congressional perspective, the president had not done enough. So in 1867, they decided to take their power and try Reconstruction on their own. This was after race riots had been going on down in the South. So this new step, this military reconstruction that Congress created, they divided the South into 5 military districts and put them under martial law. Each of these 5 districts would be headed up by a Union general and occupied by Union troops. So they are an occupied territory down in the South. They also disenfranchised or denied the right to vote to tens of thousands of former Confederates. And before they could rejoin the Union, because from a radical Republican perspective, they had seceded. Before they could be readmitted as states to the Union, they had to do several things. First and foremost, they had to ratify the 14th Amendment, granting African Americans citizenship rights. And also they had to guarantee black voting rights in their state constitutions. Now, they didn't want to do this on a national level because many of the moderate Republicans were kind of nervous about this idea of required black voting. So as part of a deal to make with them, they said, okay, well, we'll just require them to do this in their state constitutions. Now, from the president's perspective, this was usurping or taking his power away as commander-in-chief. But by this point, Congress doesn't care. They're fed up with Andrew Johnson, and they're going to do what they want to do. But around this time, there is this fear, especially in the South, that this martial law is leading to too much military control, that they're taking advantage of the South. So in a court case, Supreme Court case, Ex parte Milligan, the Supreme Court ruled in the case of these military tribunals that were being held in the South, that civilians were not allowed to be held or tried in a military tribunal or a military court if civilian courts were open, that the military was overstepping its bounds and trying civilians in these military courts. Also, Congress starts to worry that, okay, so we're requiring these southern states to allow African American voting in their state constitutions. But what's to stop them from getting readmitted to the United States and then just getting rid of it to change their state constitutions? So many radical Republicans especially started advocating for a 15th Amendment requiring national black voting rights. So it's very important right here that I highlight this. You should always remember till the end of time the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments collectively are known as the Reconstruction Amendments. 13 abolished slavery, 14 gave African Americans voting or citizenship rights, not voting, and 15 gave them voting rights. Know those till the end of time. 13th, 14th, and 15th are the Reconstruction Amendments. And so this is creating a lot of distaste among Southerners at this time. They feel like a conquered territory. They feel like they are being dragged back to the Union kicking and screaming. But they're going to do what they have to do to get reconstructed, to be able to rejoin the Union. But they're not happy about it. And so the minute these troops leave the South after Reconstruction comes to an end, we see a return to the Redeemer governments, as they're called, or home rule governments in the South, meaning they will be solidly Democrat for the next 100+ years. The solid South is this idea that Southerners would not vote for the party of Lincoln for a very, very long time. The Redeemer governments are solidly Democratic governments down in the South, returning to power after the military left. Here you see these 5 military districts. Another issue to contend with is freedmen, the former slaves, what to do with them after the war was over, how to integrate them into society. Now, from Lincoln and Johnson's perspective, they both agreed that maybe that suffrage could come to African Americans, voting rights could come to African Americans, but on a gradual basis, once they proved themselves to society, maybe through education, property ownership, etc. Maybe someday they can vote. And like I'd said before, moderate Republicans were were kind of nervous about requiring all states to allow African American voting rights, especially since many northern states had been denying black voting rights since forever. So until the 15th Amendment was ratified, many northern states didn't even allow black voting rights anyway. But as voting and citizenship rights started coming for African Americans, we see this one civic organization formed, the Union League. This is a group for African American men to start gaining some power within society. This is a political activist group organizing civic education to educate people on politics, to help campaign for Republican candidates in the future, build schools, churches, etc., and to help create more power for African Americans in the United States. So with universal manhood suffrage, with the passage and the ratification of the 15th Amendment, African Americans were given the right to vote. And down in the South, because so many white Southerners had been denied the right to vote during military Reconstruction, we actually see several black congressmen and senators elected between 1868 and 1876, 14 to be exact, to represent their districts. One of whom came from Jefferson Davis's home district, where he had formerly been a congressman. Here you see this first group of African American senators and representatives. Now, the South is obviously angry. They feel like an occupied territory. They're angry that they're being required to give so much power away. And so they come up with these two terms. And these are very important to know as well. From a Southerner's perspective, anyone who is a white Southerner and a Republican, aka helping the new regime, was a scalawag. From their perspective, they were a thief. They were stealing from their own kind. They were turning their back on their own people. So white Republican Southerners were scalawags. This is a derogatory term. Also, somebody who was called a carpetbagger. This would be a white northerner coming down from the north to come to the south, allegedly for personal profit, meaning they packed up all their stuff in a carpet bag, which is just a type of luggage, and came down to the south to benefit from the South's demise. Now, the reality was that these carpetbaggers and scalawags, sure, there was corruption going on, like in any other part of American society, but they did help to bring about some needed reforms to the Southern society. Reforms to public schools, the tax system, creating public works projects to rebuild roads, etc., etc. So the carpetbaggers and scalawags, even though they have a negative connotation to them from a Southerner's perspective, they weren't all bad. Also in response to this anger that the South was forming, in 1866 in Tennessee, the Ku Klux Klan, also known as the Invisible Empire, was formed in Tennessee by ex-Confederates. Their purpose is to put blacks and white Republicans in their place, to reestablish the power structure that white Southerners had had before the war, to use violence and intimidation to push these people away from the polls so that they're not voting. And so they used, obviously, a lot of violence and intimidation to get their way, to keep African Americans and white Republicans from voting in the South. Now, Congress, seeing this terrorism going on in the South, obviously is angry about this. That we didn't fight a civil war, 600,000 men didn't die to recreate this system. And so in 1870 and 1871, Congress passed the Force Acts to use federal troops to try to end this violence. But even with this, white Southerners continued to join the KKK and other organizations of the like, and this terrorism continued. And in fact, we're going to see starting around 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, white Southerners openly ignoring the 14th and 15th Amendments and denying African American rights in the South. And we'll talk about that later. Here you see a political cartoon from a Southerner's perspective depicting one of these white Northerners coming down to steal from the Southerners, a carpetbagger. Now, Johnson at this time, remember, he is a Democrat, and Congress is over him. They're sick and tired of him vetoing all their pieces of legislation. Even though they can override Johnson's veto, it doesn't matter. From a radical Republican's perspective, he is a nuisance to Congress. And so a scheme is hatched within by these radical Republicans to remove Johnson from office. If Johnson was removed from office through the impeachment process, he would have been replaced by the President pro tem of the Senate, Ben Wade. Remember, there is no VP at this time. So the next in line would have been a radical Republican, Ben Wade. And so the radical Republicans pass in 1867 the Tenure of Office Act. The Tenure of Office Act basically said, and it was a flagrant attempt on their part to get Johnson to do something about it. Basically saying that the president had to get the consent of the Senate if he wanted to fire any sort of appointee, meaning a cabinet member. Now, the entire cabinet at this time was Lincoln's cabinet, so none of these men had been appointed by Johnson himself. Now, Johnson felt that it was completely within his bounds to fire a member of the executive branch because he is the president. And so he fired the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. Now, he had been butting heads with Edwin Stanton for a long time, and so he felt it was within his purview to fire him. After he fired Stanton in 1868, Congress began impeachment proceedings. Now, it is important that you know this. Impeachment does not mean remove from office. Impeachment means to bring charges against. So it is kind of like the grand jury of a trial. So is there enough evidence to take it to trial? So the House of Representatives does the impeaching. If they vote yes to impeach, meaning there is enough evidence to take it to the next step, then the Senate hears the case for removal. An impeachment proceeding was brought against Johnson, and he was easily impeached by the House. So yes, he was impeached. It then moved on to the Senate. The Senate then heard the case for whether or not Johnson should be removed from office. Now, from Johnson's perspective, he said he felt that the Tenure of Office Act was unconstitutional, and he was trying to create a test case that the Supreme Court could rule on. He didn't think it would take it to this level. But the question that the senators started to ask themselves is that in the Constitution, it's very vague on why a president should be impeached and then removed from office, just for, quote, high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, is firing the Secretary of War a high crime and misdemeanor? The Senate, leery about doing this, started to change their mind. And so on May 16th, 1868, Johnson avoided removal from office by one vote. They needed a 2/3 vote in order to remove him from office, but a deal was basically struck in which Johnson would kind of just let Congress do what they wanted if they retained him as president. And also, many of the moderate Republicans worried that this would destroy checks and balances. Are we creating a bad precedent here where future presidents will have to fear Congress if they choose to act the way they deem to be appropriate? And also, Ben Wade was extremely radical. Many people were worried about him as a president. So, nonetheless, Johnson was impeached but not removed from office for these reasons. Now, a little bit of foreign policy going on at this time. In 1867, the country of Russia wanted to sell their territory of Alaska. They wanted to keep Alaska out of Great Britain's hands because then it would give Great Britain even more dominance over the seas. Remember, Great Britain owns Canada at this time. From a Russian perspective, Alaska was an economic liability. They felt that it had been, quote, furred out, meaning they'd killed all the little critters that they could up there. And so they offered to sell Alaska to the United States for $7.2 million. Secretary of State at this time, William Seward, was an expansionist, and he also wanted to keep this out of the hands of Great Britain. So he signed this treaty with Russia to buy Alaska for $7.2 million. Now, at the time, people across the country thought this was the most ridiculous purchase the United States could have ever made. They made fun of him, calling Alaska Seward's Folly. It was a big joke that he'd bought this ice wasteland to the north for $7.2 million. Now, obviously, they didn't realize at the time the economic potential that Alaska has for us today. He didn't want to offend them, and who knew what kind of future economic economic opportunity would be available. So even though he was made fun of at the time, it's probably a good thing that he bought Alaska. Now, Reconstruction overall. Was this a success or was this a failure? This is still something that historians discuss even to today. To the white South, Reconstruction was terrible. It was, the white Northerners attempting to change them in every way possible, racially, socially, and politically. To them, this is way too difficult. It is too much change in such a short amount of time. From a radical Republican perspective, they felt that Reconstruction should have been harsher. And also keep in mind, there was no clear picture of what Reconstruction should have looked like. You have all these different phases of Reconstruction. The presidential phase and the difference of opinion between both Lincoln and Johnson, the congressional phase, and even that, the difference of opinion between moderate and radical Republicans, the institution of the military Reconstruction in the South. It was just a hodgepodge, piecemeal, put together piece of legislation. But at its heart, it did focus on wanting to protect these freedmen. And so even though it was good at its heart, the reality was that even though they did get African Americans citizenship rights and the right to vote, for the next 100 years or so, African Americans in the South would be denied the right to vote. And we'll talk about that as Reconstruction comes to an end in the next couple of chapters. And many moderate Republicans were very worried that we would never be able to integrate the African Americans as into full citizenship rights without the South's desire. So even though they meant well, many historians wonder whether or not Reconstruction could have gone a step further, whether it actually was a success. So this is something that is still being debated by historians today. And that is chapter 22.